Hello, everyone. Welcome to April Book Story. I am your host, Gabriel Hunter Chang, and today I am here with Matthew Fox Amato. He is a professor of history at University of Idaho and the author of Exposing Slavery, Photography, Human Bondage, and the Birth of Modern Visual Politics in America. Hi, Matt.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, thanks for coming on. To jump right into it, so in this book, you marry the fields of history, visual cultural studies, along with elements of art history, all to examine how Americans dealt with the issue of slavery. What drew you to this approach, and why did you focus on slavery as the subject?
That's a great question. And I was always interested in thinking about images as evidence rather than just illustrations, which is a kind of older way in which images were treated by historians. I got interested in this project actually through the work of Susan Sontag, who is a great theorist of photography. I remember reading two of her major works on photography and regarding the pain of others. And one of the issues she's mulling in those books is what representations of suffering do. Do these images promote empathy that leads to some further form of political engagement? Or do they simply produce a kind of compassion fatigue in which we see images of pain and suffering, but they don't lead us to do anything further than that, and even more so, we become desensitized to them. And so thinking about Sontag's questions got me interested in this. I wanted to understand this issue at its origins by looking at early photography. I was aware at that time, this is when I was starting my dissertation, which eventually became the book. I was aware at that time of certain images that abolitionists produced, particularly the scourged back, which is an image taken of a fugitive slave who basically enters Union lines near Baton Rouge in 1863 and poses turning his back, his scarred back towards the camera. Abolitionists circulated that image quite a bit during the Civil War. I was also interested in images that abolitionists produced of themselves, especially Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And so initially my project was going to be about abolitionist photography. It was going to be about how a social movement used photography for different political and moral purposes. That being said, once I actually started to do the research, one of the things I began to come across were photographs produced not in the North, but actually in the South of enslaved people by slaveholders. I started to recognize that in the 1840s and 1850s, enslavers were bringing enslaved people to Southern photograph studios and getting their pictures made. And so what happened was my project began to shift from one that was about social movement image making to thinking about photography as a technology between anti-slavery and pro-slavery proponents. And so that's what eventually became my book, a study that looks at how photography shaped and then in turn was shaped by conflicts over slavery from its birth in 1839 to the end of the Civil War in 1865.
And what were these archives that you found, or what were these sources that you found where you were able to piece together this kind of wider range for your original focus?
It's an archive of abolitionist photographs on the one hand, but also primarily studio photographs of enslaved people on the other hand. Enslavers are bringing enslaved people to studios and making individual portraits. They're making portraits occasionally of enslaved people posing with other enslaved people. They're making pictures of usually enslaved women holding white children for the camera, and also occasionally enslaved people holding different tools for their labor. Mm-hmm. These photographs, if there was a box out there with 50 photographs of enslaved people, studio portraits of enslaved people, they would have been written about 15, 20 times by now. One of the things I had to do was actually piece my archive together, archive by archive. So my initial research, was done through a long research road trip that went basically. I was in California. It went basically from Texas to the East Coast, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Then I worked on the abolitionist side, primarily in the North. And I really had to piece that archive together. I'd find 1, 2, maybe 3 at most photographs of enslaved people at each archive. Sometimes I found none, but when I found 1 or 2, that was really actually a great moment.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of method, how did you approach these photographs in the book? I feel like you do kind of approach them in a slightly different way than they may have been used by other historians.
Yeah. Well, when I think about photographs of enslaved people, I try to think about them as both visual and material objects. So I first begin to look at what's inside the images, which is, what are the visual elements of the images. And in these studio portraits, one of the striking things is they're actually largely drawing upon dominant conventions of the day. I wish I could talk about a photograph that we could see right now, but one of the things you see is them drawing on formulas that were present in the mid 19th century, whether it's someone placing an arm on a circular cloth table, whether it's someone, an enslaved person, posing, gazing slightly to the side of a camera. These are largely well-dressed enslaved people, which is in some ways not surprising. Enslavers aren't going to want to show that enslaved people were impoverished or treated poorly, so we're getting well-dressed people in these portraits. And so in various ways, I try and think about how they are drawing upon the dominant conventions of the day, how they're also extending and departing from past ways of visualizing slavery. So one of the striking things in that regard is, if you look at the longer history of visual images of slavery, by and large, enslaved people exist as marginal figures in those images. In colonial and 19th century America, in portraits, you see enslaved people largely on the sides of the scene. In landscape paintings of plantations, typically the land, the livestock, and the plantation home, those features take precedence rather than enslaved people's bodies. So when you move from painting to photography, one of the things that happens is enslaved people move from the margins to the centers of the frames. One of the things I try and argue is that enslavers are trying to use these images as a means of pro-slavery propaganda, as a means of showing that slavery wasn't commodifying enslaved people, which in fact it was, but rather was a kind of benevolent institution. That's how I understand them, as pro-slavery rhetoric. But there's another step to that, and that's, as I mentioned, treating these as material objects, because these are images that are being mailed by enslavers from one to another. These are images that are being displayed on enslavers' desks. One remarkable instance I write about is of a man named Edward J. Pringle, who comes from an enslaving family in Charleston. And in the 1850s, Pringle moves from South Carolina to San Francisco to practice law. And one day in the mid 1850s, he writes back to his mom and he says, "Mom, thanks so much for sending me your photograph. It looks exactly like you. And I want to say a special thanks for sending me the photograph of Mac." Mac was an enslaved butler in the Pringles Charleston townhome. Mm-hmm. And Pringle writes a full paragraph about Mac. He says, "Mac is better dressed than anyone in California. Mac is an amazing representation," something to the tune of, "Mac is a remarkable representation of our institution. I keep him in my office and I show him to everyone who walks in." Right? So when you begin to look at these images not simply as visual but also material objects, you come to see them as part of an emergent cultural practice, which is to say, for the longest time, when we've tried to understand the defense of slavery, we've looked at the words of famous people and slaveholders. We've looked at the words of politicians and clergy. We've looked at what enslavers said. One of the things you see here is enslavers initiating a photographic, a political, a cultural practice where we get everyday slaveholders justifying for themselves and others enslavement through these images and through what they're suggesting slavery is, and how these images show it.
Right. And it's so that'll lead into so for the viewers and for those who may not have read it, the book is split into 4 parts, more or less 4 parts, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, discussing how different social groups of people maybe interacted with photographs or used photography to define social limits, to define social identities. Yeah. So we're going to go through chapter by chapter, because it really works in the book to talk about these individually, but also in how interconnected these phenomena are. And I think that that'll be a great way to do to do our discussion today as
Mhm.
well. So in chapter one, to kind of harken back to what you were just saying, you discuss the ways in which Southern slaveholders depicted enslaved people, and use this phrase, the quiet habit of power that slaveholders initiated through photography. What was this quiet habit of power?
This quiet habit of power was, it really describes a more private and semi-public use of photography, first and foremost, rather than the mass production of photographs. Because these images that enslavers are making in the 1840s and 1850s, for the most part, cannot be reproduced. Daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, those are some of the first early photographic processes in America, cannot be reproduced. It's not until right around the turn of the 1860s, right as the Civil War begins, that you get mass reproducible paper photography. So they're largely doing this in private and in semi-public places like Edward J. Pringle's office. And the quiet habit of power, that term describes the ways in which enslavers take up photography, which I understand is a neutral technology at its onset, and they turn it into a tool for reinforcing racial hierarchy and building white supremacist networks. And maybe I'll say a little bit more concretely about what I mean when I say reinforcing racial hierarchy, in part because, Gabriel, you also talked about how I'm interested in both what these images are doing in terms of elevating, but also setting limits on the boundaries for identity. And that's part of my basic point about these photographs of enslaved people. On the one hand, we get enslavers in some ways elevating enslaved people with photography, picturing them, in nicer clothing, not, picturing them dissenting from their position as enslaved people. We get that elevation on the one hand, and not surprisingly, that elevation is being used to show that slavery is benevolent. Yeah, on the other hand, enslavers have a cultural problem, because if you think about what people are saying about photographic portraiture at this time, they're saying, when you look at what a lot of the photographers are saying, it's that a portrait is meant to show the individuality of the subject. It's meant to show, one of the photographers I write about is Marcus Root, a Philadelphia photographer, and he basically says photography is meant to show what differentiates that photographic subject from all others. Mm-hmm. So they've got a problem, because they want to and need to elevate enslaved people to show slavery was benevolent, but they don't want to elevate them so far that they actually could be seen on par with free white people, so far that they could be seen as free individuals, self-possessed free individuals. And so one of the really interesting and more subtle things you see happening in this pro-slavery photography is enslavers setting limits on what poses enslaved people could adopt in the studio. So one example, free white women are quite often seen posing with books, a sign of literacy, a sign of intellect in the mid-19th century. In my research, I have not seen any person I could confidently identify as an enslaved person posing with a book, right? There are other devices that they're also avoiding, devices that connoted stature, for instance. You see, I write about one aristocratic enslaver named Charles Manigault, who poses in a full-length portrait. He's standing up. He's got an arm. He's got a hand resting assertively on his hip. It's a pose that's meant to convey his stature, his wealth, his authority. You don't see enslaved people posing in that sort of pose. So there are various ways in which they're both elevating their slaves, but also subordinating them, trying to bar them from achieving a pose that would be seen as full personhood in other people's eyes.
Right, right. And but then you also write that, I mean, nevertheless, even though they tried their best to prevent that, they still introduced, as you put it, they introduced bondspeople to a new way of seeing themselves in society, which is sort of how you lead into chapter 2, in which you talk about the photographic practices of enslaved people, And the kind of counterpart to this quiet habit of power is the quiet habit of endurance that they were able to nurture through photography. So how does this phrase, I guess, could you talk about this phrase as well? And also, how does it relate to the quiet habit of power, especially in terms of just this interplay between the photographic practices of enslaved people and their enslavers?
Sure. And maybe I'll first just start by talking a little bit about what enslaved people were doing with photography,
Sure.
and then come back to this concept for how I interpret it. And this chapter was easily the most surprising from my research. It's a chapter, as Gabriel alludes to, that is about how enslaved people used photography in the 1840s and 1850s. I never thought I would write this chapter, but as I began researching particularly photographers' records and slave narratives, I started to come across instances of enslaved people from the mid-1840s onwards purchasing, obtaining, and exchanging photographs in various ways. For instance, in the late 1840s, there's one photographer named John Bear. John Bear is an itinerant who's traveling around the eastern seaboard. And as he describes, he stopped off in Winchester, Virginia, which is in the western part of the state. And he says, I put out my sign, I charged $1.50 for photographs, and I charged $1 for enslaved people. And he talks about how enslaved people came to his itinerant studio, he says, in droves to get their photographs made. And this absolutely blew my mind at first. The idea that enslaved people too, while dramatically poor as a social class, as we know, were also able to purchase their own photographs. And yet, as I began to think about it more, I realized, well, they probably wanted photographs more than free people. And so one of the things that I argue is that enslaved people use photographs not only to assert their full personhood, but also as a means of maintaining familial ties amidst the disruptions wrought by the antebellum slave trade. So we see enslaved people. I write about one enslaved person, Stephen Jordan, who talks about how right before he ran away, he kept a photo. He preserved a photograph. He hid a photograph away in his cabin of himself and his mother, and they had been separated at an auction a little while back. I write about another enslaved person who basically gets sold from Virginia. He ends up in Tennessee. And one day he sends a photograph, well, he sends a portrait, as the slave narrative describes, back to his brother in Virginia. So here I'm not really thinking about photographs as visual objects as much as I am material objects, material documents that allow dispersed families to preserve memories and even reconnect with each other. Now, it's not that all enslaved people have photographs. I don't want to make that argument, but there are some who do, and they're using them to counteract the processes of commodification that are central to American slavery. And so I call this act, this practice of using photography to counteract exploitation, a quiet habit of endurance. Again, these photographs are not photographs that are circulated widely, but privately and quietly, they are being used for enslaved people to endure.
And this was the first sustained study about slaves owning photographs.
Yeah.
Could you see, I mean, as people maybe take the work that you've done here, especially in studying in terms of, well, even just your ability to put together these archives, could you see this going in any other directions as well? Just in terms of like how slaves or enslaved people used visual culture, or ways that we might be able to apply visual culture to other social movements?
Yeah, those are two really great questions. And maybe I'll tackle your first one right now, which is how were enslaved people using visual material culture more broadly. I still think we have a lot to learn about enslaved people's relationship to images, which is to say, I was interested in how they were engaging with this new medium in the 1840s and 1850s, but it's not the first visual medium in America, and one that is working in the South. And so I think we want to know more about how they interacted with painting since the 1600s,
Mm-hmm.
how they interacted with the visual presses that become increasingly prominent in the mid 19th century. I'm thinking of Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated News, which are circulating nationally. And, were enslaved people looking at the images that Leslie's and Harper's were circulating? To what extent were they impacted by abolitionist images that circulated in the South? We know a lot about, say, how David Walker's appeal became so controversial as it began circulating in the South, but we haven't really fully addressed that sort of question in relation to various visual forms. So I think that would be kind of exciting terrain for someone to explore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to move on to chapter 3, which we had talked about a little bit at the top of the interview, but chapter 3 talks about the use of photography within the abolitionist movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you're talking about how you had different expectations for this chapter and what it would look like than what it eventually became, which also eventually became kind of the book more broadly. But what were your intentions in writing this chapter specifically, and what caused that change in approach?
I thought I would find two things that I very rarely found. The first were these images of suffering. I knew about the scourge back, and I thought I was going to find many more images like the scourge back if I dug. And I really didn't.
Mm-hmm. The scourge back was an earlier image.
The scourge back was an 1863 image. And so one of the things that was really interesting to me as I began to figure this out is, in the 1840s and 1850s, we have many fugitives who, make their way to the north, make their way to Canada, some of whom joined the abolitionist movement. And yet we don't have any images like the scourged back from fugitives, at least that I could find, before the Civil War began. That happened or didn't happen, despite the fact that in 1845, there is one image made of a scar, and that's Jonathan Walker's branded hand. Jonathan Walker is a white abolitionist who basically gets thrown in jail in Florida for trying to help a number of enslaved people escape by boat. And when he's thrown in jail, he's also branded an SS for slave stealers branded in the palm of his hand. When Walker eventually gets free, he goes back to Boston, and upon the in part, it was suggested by another abolitionist, he go and photograph his hand, and he does. And this becomes a pretty famous thing within abolitionist circles. Frederick Douglass even talks about how much of an impact the branded hand had. And yet, people like Douglass don't decide to photograph their scars. Douglass will talk about his scars on the lecture podium. And we know Douglass was the most photographed person in 19th century America at this point. And yet Douglass chooses not to photograph his scars. And we don't have any evidence of any other fugitive who did so either. So the point here is that photography for fugitives appears to be about establishing for others and conveying their personhood, arguing for their fundamental humanity, rather than trying to visualize their previously enslaved condition. So that was the first major surprise when I wrote about abolitionist photography. Mm-hmm. The second was that, and I don't know why I thought this, but I expected, when you think about abolitionist visual culture, you think about images of the South, you think about images of slave auctions, you think about images of torture taking place on plantations. Those are the images that abolitionists are producing before the 1840s, and especially from the 1830s onwards. And yet, one of the things I realized is, photography was a bad tool to continue that iconography because cameras were too clunky and exposure times were too slow to actually make action shots. It was, pretty much impossible for an abolitionist. I don't have any evidence even of them trying to take a camera south and trying to photograph a slave auction. So it's a bad tool to picture slavery, but it was a really good tool, I argue, for abolitionists to picture themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my points, and I'd be happy to talk about this more, is that abolitionists begin using photography to visualize their movement and to circulate photographs within the movement as a way of building it from within.
Yeah, you said it becomes like sort of form of a social movement glue. Um, I mean, like how are the abolitionists unique in using photography to that end, as opposed to maybe some of the other groups that we talk about, or even just other social movements going on at the time in the United States?
That is in part something I hope other people will publish on. You know, on the one hand, all Americans are using photography as a material object to strengthen social bonds. This is something, when we talk about the exchange of photographs, we've often talked about it in terms of families. You know, a family member is traveling and he or she sends a photograph back to a loved one. People talk about Civil War soldiers in this way all the time. You know, Civil War soldiers get portraits made on the war front and they send them back to the home front. A way to remember one another, a way to see one another, at least photographically speaking, a way to preserve and build those bonds. So all Americans are engaging in that sort of practice, likely other social movements too. I think abolitionists were innovators, not so much in the kind of practice of exchanging images, but instead in the types of images they were making. So they begin to initiate this practice of photographing the suffering of others, not so much by photographing enslaved people, as I was talking about before, or formerly enslaved people, but instead by photographing rebels, both black and white, who are trying to help fugitive slaves escape and or spark slave rebellion. So I write about a few different instances of this, some lesser known, like John Doy and Passmore Williamson. I also write about the well-known, excuse me, I'm knocking my computer. I also write about the well-known one, which is John Brown. When John Brown fails at Harper's Ferry in 1859, one of the things abolitionists do pretty much immediately after he's captured is they begin circulating his image. And so, on the one hand, the circulation part isn't new, but this practice of circulating someone who's sort of suffering for the cause, a rebel who's trying to engage in radical action, that I argue is something new with abolitionists.
And so you talked there about how Civil War soldiers used photography and sending images home and picturing themselves. You also talk about in chapter 4 how in which you focus on interracial photographs in Civil War camps, and it's this moment of tremendous racial uncertainty in which white Northern soldiers are using photography to actually reinforce a sense of racial hierarchy. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and how it sort of picked up from like the Southern slaveholders' sense of like their quiet habit of domination as well.
Yeah. The scene, the photographic scene in Union Army camps is a remarkable one. These are places where these are haphazard biracial communities that form, places where you have thousands of fugitive slaves entering from the South, thousands, of course, of primarily white Union soldiers coming from the North, and then hundreds of photographers basically milling about the studios. And one of the things that is particularly important here is the photographers are not the only ones interested in making interracial photographs. We see white Union soldiers engaging in that practice. So I was lucky enough to stumble upon the letters of one white Union soldier from Massachusetts who is writing back to his wife constantly, particularly in 1863 and 1864, talking constantly about enslaved people that he sees. And one day, he writes this to his wife, and I believe his children too. He says, I had I'm blanking on the fugitive's name, but he says I had him come outside the tent, and I told him to pose at my feet, basically to sit down in front of me, and we had our photograph taken. And this is a pose of a black man sitting or kneeling before a white soldier that you see throughout the archive. Right? So here we get an instance of a white Union soldier talking about how this is actually his idea to do so. And my argument here is that in these subordinating poses, getting black men who are mostly likely fugitive slaves to either sit at your feet or sit at your feet and hold a teacup up to you, or stand on the sidelines with a pitcher or food or something else you're going to serve those white Union soldiers in the center of the scene. These subordinating poses are ways in which white Union soldiers are trying to articulate what they see as the state of race relations. It's a hierarchical relationship that they want to trumpet, they want to concretize in this moment when it's becoming clear and clear that something is likely going to happen to slavery. Slavery is likely going to fall. Mm-hmm. And so it's a kind of, what will race relations look like in a nation without slavery? While we don't get a lot of Union soldiers, writing lengthy, essays about race relations, we do see them articulating that with photography. And I argue that this is in many ways another form of the kind of quiet habit of domination that we saw with enslavers. Slightly different in terms of what they're doing, but again, using photographs to articulate racial hierarchy.
Is there any direct relationship between, even just the visual language? Obviously, there's going to be different signifiers, but just in the visual language that they use to bring this point across with like Southern slaveholders before them?
In some ways, mm-hmm. I'm not trying to argue that this is the exact same thing, and my point is actually that the visuals vary more than they're similar. The ways in which Union visuality is similar to Southern visuality, I think it is more about the connection between those Union photographs and the paintings that enslavers are making than the photographs. So there's a kind of direct visual resonance between subordinating Union photographs and paintings in which we see enslaved people on the margins of the canvas. That's, I think, where you see a similarity. The contrast between enslavers' photographs and Union photographs is actually pretty stark. We don't get, by and large, enslaved people on the margins of photographs. As I've suggested, we see them move to the centers of the frames in that case. And so when we compare photograph to photograph, actually, I think the visuality is quite different. That being said, the ways in which, and I talked about this a little, the ways in which enslavers are using their photographs is in some ways similar in that, they're trying, when enslavers talk about the photographs they make, they're often undercutting enslaved people that are posing. So this is in some ways going back to my first chapter. On more than one occasion, you get enslavers talking about how they laughed at the enslaved person posing. Edward Pringle says, "I've laughed over Mac a dozen times." So it's a kind of, you could never actually achieve the connotations, the visual connotations of your portrait. You can never actually achieve, for instance, a kind of bourgeois, respectable status, right? And so in that way, I think they're similar to the Union photographs, which are also in many ways working to undercut the aspirations of these kind of freshly freed, or at least not enslaved people anymore.
And so much of this kind of ties back to, you talk about a little bit all of this, this relationship to the question of Southern modernity, and the question, even when historians talk about causes of the Civil War, this question of like Southern turning their backs on modernity, that's not quite in favor anymore as a reading. Mm-hmm. But with with these issues of just technology, progress, modernity, how do you think slavery brought, like, what role did it play in visual culture and photography, and bringing all of that into the modern age?
That's a great question. And that's really the second, the first part of my story is how photography shapes conflicts over slavery. The second part is how slavery shapes photography. And so, in various ways, what I'm trying to show, first off, I'm trying to show that there actually was a kind of significant history of Southern photography during slavery. We've tended to focus more on the North, and I'm trying to bring out that Southern side of the story. And I'm trying to show that through these conflicts over slavery, photography actually becomes a political tool. In 1839, photography is born pretty much simultaneously in France and Britain. The French process comes to American shores in 1839. And in that moment, there are all sorts of ideas about what photography could be. But there's no clear idea about how photography is going to be used for political purposes. If we fast forward to the 20th and 21st century, it's pretty much commonplace that you would use photography to visualize social conditions that you want to reform. It's also pretty much commonplace by the 20th century that perpetrators too, that exploiters are using photography. It's commonplace that photography is going to be used for propaganda. But none of that was inevitable. My point in this book is that we see enslavers, we see enslaved people, we see abolitionists actually taking up a neutral technology and warping its cultural associations, so that by 1865, it is pretty clear that you would use photography within a social movement to build those bonds, to, by the time you get to the Scourged Back, try and visualize social conditions you want to either reform or abolish. It has become common for exploiters, enslavers, to use photography as a tool of propaganda, as a tool of surveillance, and it's become common too for people who are exploited to try and use photography for those purposes. So that's the story I'm trying to tell, is one in which we get a technology, a visual technology, that's actually turned, that's transformed through political conflict into a political tool.
Great. Thank you, Matt. That is the time that we have today.
Okay.
Thanks so much for coming on. It's been great talking with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.